Alrighty, hi everyone. How's everyone doing?
Fine, thank you. And you?
Good. I'm good, thank you. Alrighty, so can you guys please introduce yourself?
Well, I'm Dirk. I'm from the Department of Political Sciences at UNISA.
And I'm Lawrence Hamilton. I hold a SA UK bilateral chair in political theory at the University of the Witwatersrand and the University of Cambridge.
Awesome, thank you so much. So obviously we've come here today because the topic of Afghanistan and everything that's happening there has become quite relevant. Firstly, what is actually happening in Afghanistan?
You go ahead, Dirk.
Yes, well, what we are seeing now in the latest few days is the takeover by the Taliban movement of the government of Afghanistan. They have been there for about 40 years. They have previously also been in power after the departure of the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union has entered Afghanistan in the late 1970s, 1979. And the Taliban was formed to a large extent as in response to that. Some people said it was mainly an initiative from the American side. But given all these situations, and we will get to the details of it, but the main point is now is that the elected governments of the past of Afghanistan was overthrown, taken away by the Taliban in the process, which is unique in the sense that it wasn't a military coup just in one center of the country as a whole, but it was actually an occupation of all centers of the country within a very short space of time.
Interesting.
Anything you could add on that, Dr. Hamilton?
Effectively, what we're seeing is America making a decision to pull out of Afghanistan, and that vacuum being filled by the Taliban, which has been a very significant force for many years, as Dirk has just said. But the backstory to this is very important. The history around why the United States have been there for 20 years, why there is this sudden vacuum. There are a whole series of really important historical things to discuss. If you're interested initially in just this, in the last few days, it looks to me like a badly organized exit on the part of the United States of America and its allies. It made a decision following, I think, a Trump decision to stop the peace talks. I think he stopped them in September 2019. There was no longer much dialogue going on, and the Taliban started to take over various parts of the country, and the writing was on the wall in some sense. And in any case, the writing had been on the wall for a while. If you looked at both Republican and Democrat positions, and then Biden makes the decision. And we see this disorderly exit, which has left a lot of people comparing it to Saigon in 1975, and putting a hell of a lot of people in Afghanistan who worked with the United States and its allies in very, directly in harm's way. We'll see how that develops, but I don't think there's much doubt that a lot of those people are flocking to the airport to get out because they're quite sure that they're in direct harm's way.
Yeah, that's definitely for sure. And then just a very general question. Why do you think the US got involved in the first place? We have a bunch of theories, obviously. Some say it could have been a humanitarian reason. Others say for control of oil and that kind of thing. Do you guys have any theories as to why they got involved initially and how it has benefited them until now?
So, sorry to jump in, but the first thing to get clear before we propose any theories is just to get clear on the facts. The US initiated the war in Afghanistan on October the 7th, 2001. And it's clear that it was in direct response to the Twin Tower terror attack orchestrated by Al-Qaeda on September the 11th, 2001. So and then President Bush signed into law a joint resolution authorizing the use of force against those responsible for attacking the United States on 9/11. And the joint resolution would later be cited by the Bush administration as legal rationale for its decision to take sweeping measures to combat terrorism, from invading Afghanistan to eavesdropping on US citizens without a court order, to setting up the detention camp at Guantanamo Bay in Cuba, and so on and so forth. At least in terms of the rationale, or the guise, if you want, the justification for the US war in Afghanistan was, as I say, under the guise of bolstering local and global security. In other words, fighting terrorism. And there was a direct link made between the Taliban regime and Al-Qaeda. So I don't think you necessarily need that much the theorization to see that those facts speak directly to a set of concerns that come out of 9/11, and that the States thinks it can resolve via an occupation of Afghanistan, amongst other things, of course. It didn't just occupy Afghanistan, it did a lot of other things as well. But I just wanted to sort of get those facts on the table first. Maybe Dirk has some theories.
Yeah.
Well, I think these are the facts, and that's sort of the factual reason for the entry of the US. And I think what is important is we have to take ourselves back to the period around about 2001 and the attacks on the Twin Towers, and the American public opinion of saying, you know, something must be done. There must be a retaliation. There must be a form of revenge against what happened in New York City. And the easy option, the immediate option for the US, for the American government, was to say Al-Qaeda was responsible for it. At that stage, they didn't have really necessarily all the intelligence evidence of that, but they had to respond almost immediately. And that was therefore, in a sense, a political decision in the first instance, not a military decision. Obviously, the military actions followed after that. And it was then to identify Afghanistan as the host of Al-Qaeda. We must remember Al-Qaeda is a movement that started in Saudi Arabia. But Saudi Arabia could not be identified by the US as a possible target or as a country that they will use to retaliate against, because Saudi Arabia was such an important ally of the United States in the Middle East in general. So that created quite a dilemma for the US government and President Bush and his administration of how to respond and what will be the most appropriate response. And that is why Afghanistan was identified. But as we have seen now, Afghanistan in the end became not a very sustainable sort of opponent for the US in terms of this. And the point where we are today is, in a sense, I would say, evidence of the fact that that initial decision was a sort of opportunistic one in order to respond to 9/11, but it could not be sustained because it started to involve a regional situation, especially Pakistan, because the Taliban has been to a large extent had very close relationships with Pakistan. And Pakistan is obviously involved in the situation with India, especially Kashmir, and was involved in the Cold War between the Russians and the Chinese, who supported India and Pakistan. So I think if one looks at it in a more general sense, it is the US wanted to have a base in the Middle East, or close to the Middle East in the case of Afghanistan, close to these centers that are very important for the geopolitics of the US. And I think therefore Afghanistan became an ideal sort of opportunity for them. But at the same time, we know that Afghanistan has the reputation as a country that over the centuries could never be governed by outside forces. All of them failed. The last time was the Soviet Union between 1979 and 1990.
Right.
Just to add to that, you know, we can theorize. I have some theories myself, very much along the lines of Dirk's, but just to reinforce what he's just said, some more facts. The US occupied Kabul and dismantled the Taliban regime. 9 years later, in 2010, they were still in Afghanistan, and they increased their troops to 100,000 American troops.
Mm.
Wow.
It's not the US occupation of Afghanistan, or entering Afghanistan, however you want to articulate it, is known as the longest war in its history. The war has not only killed at least 100,000 civilians, but has also left the country with difficulties in rebuilding its economy and its political system, etc., despite what America has suggested all along. And the media reports that more than 20,000 US soldiers and officers were wounded in Afghanistan, and 2,300 were killed. More than $2.26 trillion was spent in the process.
Would you then argue that the benefits to America through this war were sort of undeniable when everything was first starting out, that there were opportunities to be taken advantage of when first joining?
Yeah, so I mean, something that you learn quite early on in dealing with the political world is something known as the unintended consequences of actions, right? I think this is potentially a classic example. If we don't get too caught up in conspiracy theories around, say, oil or other sorts of things, then you can easily, you know, see why, as Dirk put it, there's an opportunistic political response to seek revenge and think that this may have, you know, maybe a prudent and efficient way of solving a supposed global terrorist threat. But, you know, the unintended consequences are there for all of us to see. Not only does it fail in its own terms, but it costs America and Afghanistan huge amounts in terms of loss of life and you know, basic resources.
Right. Yeah.
It's a classic case of a political decision going badly wrong, and many people are, of course, upset with Biden in taking this decision. But in a certain sense, you know, even though he didn't show much regret as regards the consequences of the decision, in some sense, this decision was being made for him. There was a kind of an inevitability about it, that at a certain point, you know, the states had to get out of something that was going nowhere and just costing huge amounts of, you know, resources and lives.
Right. Yeah.
When researching for this specific topic, I came across an article that spoke about one of the main reasons why Biden decided to pull out was because of the fact that a majority of the population of America, or the American voters, weren't happy with the fact that America was involved with Afghanistan. How large do you think this kind of a topic, what would you call it, this reasoning weighed on Biden's decision?
These type of matters are not very important in terms of domestic politics in the US. International relations in general are not playing a very important role. It is the economy. That's, we all know, that goes back to the Reagan times, to the Clinton times, to all presidents. So international relations, foreign policies, involvement in other countries of the world are important for the rest of the world, but not so important for the Americans themselves, the American public. So it doesn't play a role in, for example, last year's presidential election. It's not an issue. It's not one of the main campaigning issues. So in a sense, what President, or now President Biden, was saying last year in his campaign when he talked about these things is he wants to, or wanted then, still wants to pull out of crisis or conflict situations where the US is all over the country, all over the world. President Trump was more or less following the same route. I think it is a bit about what we are seeing in general of the US, especially during the Trump term or administration, of trying to look more inward, more looking towards the US itself. The pandemic emphasized that even more, the focus on countries about their own issues, about their domestic issues. International, maybe we will see later on again an opening up of it. President Biden did a little bit of, or did quite a lot now in terms of his relations with Europe and with the traditional allies of the US. But in general, there is the trend is that the country first. It's a sort of a nationalist approach that we are seeing in many parts of the world, including the US. So this is in line with it. It's sort of following that sentiment that does exist. US presence outside in other parts of the world, especially in the Middle East, has never been popular amongst the US public. So in a sense, it is something which, when there's a very sort of a, like in the time of 2001 with 9/11, yes, for that moment it could be justified. But the experiences of the Vietnam War is just too dominant. It is just too prevalent in the minds, in the historical minds of the US public in order to make it something which is appealing to them. They'd rather look at their economic power and relations with the rest of the world as a projection of their power and not so much a military one. The military one is, as they understand it, is something that costs a lot for the US economy and for the for the American public. And it is, many of their own family are sacrificed in the process. People are being killed as soldiers in Vietnam or in Iraq or in Afghanistan or other parts. So it's not necessarily popular. And therefore, this withdrawal was not controversial. It was in line with, I think, the general American public opinion. What has happened now is a setback because of this organized way in which it happens, and it's been seen almost as if the US lost this situation, that they were almost pushed out and they couldn't leave behind a situation which looked relatively successful from an American point of view. So that will be criticized in the American public domain, but not the withdrawal itself necessarily.
Right.
Yeah.
That makes sense. Yeah.
I mean, just to add,
yeah,
if I can, you could probably mount that sort of argument successfully were a politician, be it Republican or Democrat, coming up towards election, right? But it doesn't sound like a very good argument at the beginning of one's tenure as president. In other words, it's not as if Biden is, desperate to garner as much public support as possible because he's about to be re-elected or thrown out. I think more is keeping with his manifesto promises and just dealing with the realities on the ground. The fact that it's such a nightmarish situation speaks, I think, more to the lack of intelligence and the lack of organization that underpins it. But there may simply be, an inevitability around the historical forces at play, both military and political, right? So however organized, however good the the intelligence might have been on the ground, the Taliban forces have withstood seemingly quite well the massive amounts of soldiers and resources thrown at them by the United States, and have been able to not only involve themselves in political discussions, but organize themselves to very quickly take back over large parts of the country.
Right. So then, with all that in mind, what does that then mean for Afghanistan themselves? Seeing as this whole thing seems to have been, I believe, by President Biden's own admission, a bit faster than even they anticipated. So with the introduction of the Taliban basically, I believe, taking charge of Afghanistan now, what can we really expect to see from them in the future, not only as a country, but for the people of Afghanistan themselves?
The women's rights, the educational system, like what will happen? Because we also know that before America took over, the Taliban imposed a very harsh law. So do you think that will come back into play? What can we expect for these poor people?
So the first thing to say is that it's very clear from media reports and from a lot of laudable sources that the Taliban is in a situation now of significant military and political power. Okay, but at the same time, though, it seeks to a certain extent international legitimacy. So it probably doesn't really make sense from the Taliban's perspective to become a pariah sort of state immediately in any case. So we're seeing a lot of noises and comments coming out of the Taliban leadership about no revenge on those who have been working with the Americans and their allies. Women, so long as they wear some sort of head covering, will be able to carry on relatively as normal, etc. So what we're hearing initially is seemingly a much softer, less extremist version of what we experienced in the past, or rather what Afghanistan experienced in the past. Now, to the extent that that actually holds over time is, I think, the big question. Really, I don't think I have the answer. I mean, it would seem to me that given that it could go either way, it would depend probably very much, not so much on a moral question, or even on a moral question about how ought the Taliban to carry on from a religious perspective or just some kind of humanitarian perspective, or even on international power relations, international relations. What probably matters most is what internal faction within the Taliban gains an upper hand, whether it's a pragmatic centrist sort of position, part of the what do you call them? I mean, you'd have to call them a government now, or the more extreme faction or subsection of that government. And there's even been suggestion that the Taliban would include non-Taliban members in government. But this is to be seen. Difficult to predict, frankly.
Right. I think that's a very interesting point of having to call the Taliban a government now. That's quite an interesting concept now, given the last 20 years of history. Dr. Kotze, I wonder if you have any opinion on that idea as well.
Yeah, you said in the beginning we must get past the sort of concepts that's being used as sort of popular ideas. And I think we have to ask really hard questions now. One is the Taliban so bad as it is presented to us? Now that's hugely controversial, no? For people like us, or for the West, or for Europe, or for the UN, US, or for persons who believe in liberal ideas and human rights. No? But ultimately, from a political science or politics point of view, we say ultimately the people must decide who they want as their government. And for me, the question is, what we've seen in the last week or more, is that a choice of the people, or is it a new sort of tyranny imposed on them? The fact that the Taliban has reached this point with very little resistance, actually. Means that there is some popularity for them, that there is some people who actually want them back.
Right.
Quite a lot.
Oh.
So because they are there for 40 years already. No, it's not some other newborn organization that suddenly sort of exploited the current situation and unhappiness with the current government of Ashraf Ghani, because part of the problem over and above the American presence is the fact that the Afghani government was not a very popular government and was very much accused of being involved in corruption, and that they have become a very dependent force and could not stand very much on their own feet.
Right.
And the question from our point of view is, after 20 years, can you still look at the country and say, we recognize the government and the authority and the overall political dispensation, if it is a dispensation that is completely dependent on the outside force?
Yeah, of course.
Is it something with legitimacy then? No.
No.
So it brings us back to a point where Afghanistan must now show to the rest of the world, what do they want? What type of political system, constitutional system, religious system, social system do they want to have? And I think where we sit here in South Africa, we don't know. And I think many people in the world don't know about what exactly are the wishes of the Afghani people. What do they prefer for the foreseeable future?
Right.
And that's going to determine what Afghanistan is going to be.
Of course, and I think that actually perfectly leads to the next question, because I think our perception of the Taliban and what we know about them largely comes from Western reporting and a Western view of it. So I just wonder, without getting too much into a speculation, trying to keep things based on facts, how much do you think is of our view of the Taliban is influenced by American propaganda? And yeah, let's start with that for now.
So, I mean, while I agree with Dirk that we have to be very careful and ask these hard questions, I do think that we've also got to be very clear about the history we're dealing with. I mean, I don't think it is simply American propaganda that has led us to believe the Taliban is a force that doesn't treat people very well, its own people very well, especially women. So, and it isn't really a force that is a consequence of popular sovereignty, i.e. it isn't really a force that has arisen out of a popular process of election or selection of some kind or other. So until that happens, Dirk may be right that there is quite a lot of popular support on the ground, but we have no evidence for that. The only evidence you get for that is when you have an election of some kind or other, and then the support is produced. This taking of power, or rather, you might say, filling a vacuum of power, creates a government which seeks legitimacy, but it isn't necessarily yet one that is, we can say without equivocation that it's popularly supported. And I think we have to also look at the fact that a lot of the dissident voices that we hear, both from inside Afghanistan and outside Afghanistan, are women's voices. So a lot of the time, a lot of women who are really concerned about who were treated extremely badly under the Taliban regime, and were obviously given certain freedoms, even under an imposed regime, the American regime, but or at least the American supported regime. So we have this rather tragic situation where you have a set of tyrannical orders over time, and the only way that you can get to a situation in which you can assuredly say that this is acting in the interests of the people is when you have and in some cases you may even question whether that's possible, but when you have a democratically elected government, and this is nothing near that yet, and there hasn't been any mention by the Taliban that they're going to hold any elections. So we shouldn't get ahead of ourselves. And we should also be really, really concerned, as a lot of women have expressed on the Western and non-Western media outlets, for the lives and liberties of women in Afghanistan.
Actually, Malala was quoted saying that, I don't know if, I'm sure you guys know of Malala, but she was quoted saying that she is fearful for a lot of the women in Afghanistan because, like she has to experience, they might battle to have education and that kind of thing. So obviously that's a very fearful possibility moving forward for a lot of the women in Afghanistan. Is there anything you could add? We don't have a lot of time, but anything else you could add, Dr. Kotze?
No, I mean, that is an established fact. I mean, this is not something which is contested. I don't try to contest that when I make my point. That is clear. And I think what we are seeing is, in a sense, that there are, within Afghanistan, like many other countries in the world, there's actually not one homogeneous society. You know, there's societies with different interests. There's also a modern component of the society and a very traditional component of society. And I think these will be the main challenges for a new government, because I mean the Taliban talks now about something like almost a minor form of a government of national unity, that they will include people from different groups and not only from the Taliban, and including women also. We have to see. I mean, there Lawrence is absolutely correct. And the ultimate test will be something like an election or a referendum or a popular form of participation to determine what will be the future of the future political and constitutional dispensation of Afghanistan. But that will be the first time in how many decades that they will reach that point. You know, if the last 40 or 50 years, they were just simply not in that position where they can do that. They were always under pressure from the one or the other side, the Soviet or the American, or earlier on now Taliban itself. I think the Taliban also learned their lesson of what happened during their first period as the rulers of Afghanistan, and how it was not accepted internationally, and how they paid the price for that. And so I think it's clear what we hear now is that the Taliban is trying to address those concerns, those perceptions about them, of how they dealt with being in government or the government of Afghanistan in the past. So, but we will have to see. I mean, it's very early times. It is a type of a radical turnover of the situation in Afghanistan, and it's never easy to manage these type of situations. It's disorganized. There is the infrastructure, the institutional infrastructure is interrupted at the moment. For them to establish themselves in itself will rather be a miracle, just to be able to let the Afghanistan as a state function again to some extent, really.
Yeah, of course. This has actually been really insightful. Thank you so much for both willing to come and join us and have this conversation. I can say I've learned so much from this.
Definitely, yeah.
And as I said previously, I think there's a lot of uneducated youth that exists, especially in South Africa. And I think we often tend to acquire our information through Facebook and Instagram, which is obviously not very helpful. So thank you again for coming on here. And we both look forward to actually working with you both in the future with other podcasts, if you'd ever be interested on, kind of similar topics. But thank you again. We really, really appreciate it.
You're welcome.
Awesome. Thank you.